who have had an American education and a US background. we don't really realize the significance of England's participation in the war because we're not taught that, right? It's not our fault. We just haven't studied other countries' involvement in this particular conflict, which of course in the UK and in Europe started much earlier than US involvement. So when we talk about basic research fundamentals for this period, there's a handful of things that we definitely want to make sure we do. And these are kind of my suggested first steps. So first, write down everything you know, definite facts, but also your questions, right? Think about what your research objective is and what you're trying to accomplish through your research. Think about the soldier and his family's full name and all of the variants on those names. And I'll show you what I mean by that in just a minute. If you know the regiment or corps that they served with, that's, of course, very valuable information, but be as specific as you can. You want to think about the most likely enlistment place and date. So wherever it was they grew up, if they're in the 1911 census, which they should be, where is that exactly? What parish, what civil registration district, what street were they on? And then, of course, anything you know about the military service itself. You also want to do your basic background research. So we need to be thinking about a brief history of the Army. We need to know about what the Army looked like going into this conflict. We need to know the general statistics for the area that they lived in, but also for their service period. And then, of course, knowing your online sources, right? Like the National Archives, abbreviated here as TNA, and their blog and all of their educational resources. Those are going to help guide us all through this research process. And then, of course, your basic genealogical background facts, right? Who is his parents? You want to build a basic family tree, all of those various life events that we all cover. You want to try to name as many siblings and cousins as you can, because everybody in that generation is going to be important to telling a full and complete story. And then, of course, the locations for all of the above events as well as the dates. Okay, let's talk about names for just a second, though. Names can be tricky, especially in military records. So just looking at an example, very standard example of a man named John Lawrence. He could be talked about in military records in a variety of ways. It could be John Lawrence, John T. Lawrence, J.T. Lawrence, J. Lawrence, J. Thomas Lawrence, Thomas Lawrence, Private Lawrence, abbreviated Private J.T. Lawrence, Private John T. Lawrence, et cetera, right? So you need to be thinking about all of the different ways in which the military could have written down their name. Governments are, well, they're governments, right? They have a tendency to abbreviate. They have a tendency to try and do shorthand, especially in the middle of a conflict. If you're on the middle of a battlefield or in the trenches, you don't have time to write out John Thomas Lawrence every time, right? So put yourself in those circumstances and think about how you would have done it if you were getting, just gone through 3 days of shelling. So for that reason, I almost always start a World War I research project by saying, who's my soldier? And I literally make this list for myself. How many ways can I think of to write that guy's name out? And then I just put it on a Post-it note and it sits on my desk for the project, for the duration of the project. So I don't forget that it's easy to overlook these things, right? If you don't have an exact name match, it may still be your person of interest. Everybody still good? All right, cool. I like a lot of body language when I talk, so I appreciate that. Yeah. All right, let's talk about the military itself during this conflict. So in the UK, the British Army, of course, is the largest. It includes infantry, cavalry, and all of their support units. The Royal Navy, which includes the Royal Marines and the Merchant Navy through the Royal Naval Reserve. And then the Royal Air Force, which is established during the war years. The quote that I have in my notes actually for this is related to the British Army. This is referring to a standing army, which was quite small at the time. It says, if all hell breaks out, these are the first guys on the list, and this is how they will be organized. So we're thinking about how the army is structured going into the first months of the conflict. So when we're looking at records and researching our military ancestor, we need to understand that that means much more than just military records, of course. So we want to understand everything that's available to us, not just what the military would have recorded, but everything about their life and what might have been written down in any kind of a standard form in addition. So you're looking at service records, but also parish registers, civil registration, newspapers, medical records, casualty records, POW lists. You just don't know what you're going to explore as you go through this war experience. Unless, of course, you have a detailed biography on the soldier, and then I would ask why you're doing the research in the first place. Original sources might be a good reason, yeah. Right, so it is important to note that the UK Army did have a standing army just before the war, but it was very small. The war years forced the military to reorganize and reformat, and in some cases they did this multiple times during the course of the war for the same branch or the same units. So as a result, the records that they left behind can feel quite chaotic, sometimes overwhelming, and we'll try to take some of that confusion out and give you some tools to help understand that. But understand that when you're accessing military records, you're actually looking at a number of different varieties of sources and locations. So the first recommendation I want to make for you is actually the National Archives website. So as I mentioned earlier, acronym is TNA. Military records are held at TNA. Each collection is cataloged in a particular way, and you can see the catalog references to find various types of records. I'm going to show you that as we go through today's session. They also, of course, partner with commercial entities like Find My Past. We digitize and publish those records on their behalf and in partnership with them. So you'll see materials kind of spread across a variety of different websites. All of the sites can be accessed through local libraries in the UK and often in the United States as well, and at national institutions like the Family Search Library here in Salt Lake, or major libraries across the UK. So essentially, wherever you are, you should be able to access those commercial sites, whether you have a subscription or not. And of course, TNA does that for a variety of reasons, but they are a good partner and they do have, of course, all of the military records for the most part. We're going to take questions at the end, actually. Thank you. So on the TNA website, there are a number of places you can go. And if you actually just put in your favorite search engine, the National Archives, World War I history, you will find most of these sources. They're also in your handout. So they have an entire category for First World War in terms of educational content, descriptions of records. They have, as you can see on the list, an overview, but also material on nurses or service records, officers' information. So they break it down in quite a lot of detail and really talk about the background of not just the records, but the people, the organizations they served with, how the records are organized, etc. So first stop for everybody should be scouring the TNA website for all of that contextual information, that educational content. They also have what they call the Centenary Collection, which of course was the 100-year mark of the anniversary of the war. It's still live, even though it's a few years old now, but those blogs and all the reference material is well worth your time. You should be reading through that. They include blogs and written content, but also podcasts, videos, digitized records, and so forth. So make sure that you understand the TNA website and all that it offers. They also have a full list of digitized First World War records. Note for my US friends, it's digitized with an S, not with a Z, right? UK English versus American English. So from this page, you can get access to everything that's available online that's in their collection. If it's not on this list, it hasn't been digitized yet. So that would mean you're contacting the archive for access in a different way. But there is a pretty significant list here. And they do keep it relatively current. So I mentioned earlier that everything is cataloged, and of course that's true. So a couple things that you'll want to watch for. So almost every reference, especially with the larger online partners like Find My Past, we will often refer to the WO sequence, right? Or whatever that code is. So in this case, WO stands for War Office, 97 is the piece number. When you find that on a site like Find My Past, you can then go back to the National Archives and see it in their description. So you know you're looking at exactly the same pieces of material. So this is from the National Archives website, and it actually says WO 97 as the Chelsea pension records from the Royal Hospital in Chelsea, and it gives you a full description of what those records are. Does that make sense to everybody? So familiarize yourself with the way TNA catalogs things, because that is how their digital partners carry that forward onto their sites as well. And we use the same language so that everything is universal. So it's easy to find from Find My Past over to the TNA website. All right, so let's talk about how the Army was organized a little bit. Some of these graphics are going to get kind of detailed and hard to read. Don't try to memorize it or anything. Just go to Wikipedia and find it for yourself. Okay? But we have at the top general headquarters, then the corps and armies, then the divisions, then the brigades, and then the battalions. We're going to really focus on these lower sections. The divisions is where the bulk of the men sit. 20,000 men form an infantry, artillery, or engineer unit. This also includes the medical and signal services. They're commanded by a major general, and they hold the front line of approximately 2 to 3 miles. Brigades include 4 battalions. Machine gun and trench mortar units are typically included in a brigade. And then the battalions consist of 1,000 men each and 35 officers at full strength. It was the center of the world. This is where they are fed, where they're paid, where they're clothed, where they were prepared for battle, where they recovered from battle, where they arranged their leave and recreation time. So for our individual ancestors, the battalion is the level where everything happened. But understanding the structure helps us understand the records. I'm also going to ask that you respect my privacy and copyright concerns, and please cease in taking photos of the slides. So when you look at a battalion, which is again where most of the soldiers live out their daily life, the battalion will include 4 companies that are all led by officers. Each company has 16 platoons, and then each platoon has 64 sections. You got that? Right? It's totally straight and ready in your head? Okay. So the top 2 layers, the companies and the platoons, are led by officers. So in many cases, you're looking for references to officer so-and-so to help understand your soldier situation. In the sections, they're led by non-commissioned officers, right? So understanding the difference between the two and how the Army works is kind of important in terms of interpreting the records. Note also that a battalion would include their own specialist services, cooks, signalers, machine gunners, etc. All of those are assigned to a specific battalion. Right, so then the pre-war Army experience was different than that, right? Each regiment had 2 battalions pre-war of regular soldiers plus several battalions of territorial or part-time soldiers. Because of this dramatic increase in personnel, the number of regiments had a significant increase, now had a dozen or more battalions each. And that leads us to the British Expeditionary Force. This is where, and this is new to the British Army at this point. They've never organized like this before World War I. So it's the first time they used this system during active conflict. The plan for this type of system really began in 1909 after the Second Boer War. I'm really tripping on some words, sorry. The initial core of forces under this name are generally referred to as only the forces present in France prior to the end of the First Battle of Ypres on the 22nd of November, 1914. But by the end of 1914, the current BEF, or British Expeditionary Force, had been almost entirely exhausted. So we're in 1914 and the British Expeditionary Force is almost completely gone in its initial structure. So the organization of kind of this regular home-based force into this larger entity versus the previous system of sending individual units out one at a time and giving each unit their own specific instructions, that begins to fade. And they kind of take over this whole idea of we're going to serve one army to go into the entirety of Europe and try and fight these battles. Of course, originally they deployed to the Western Front of France at the start of the war. That consisted initially of just the 6 infantry divisions and 1 cavalry division in support of the French troops. Obviously, it didn't stay that low for very long. So the British Expeditionary Force is the name that sticks, and that becomes the official name of British armies in both France and Flanders throughout the war. So if you see a note of BEF, or British Expeditionary Force, in your ancestors' record, you know immediately they are likely in France and Flanders, and they could have been there at any time during the course of the war. If you don't see that, then maybe they were in Egypt or some other theater. So, British Expeditionary Force in 1914. Again, this is on Wikipedia, so I know it's hard to read, but it does give you quite a lot of detail about how the British Army is now structured. When you go into this detail, you can actually see quite a lot. Let me just click one more time. But it does show exactly where your unit sat in this larger grand scheme. So when you zoom in on this little chart, that's available to all of us, of course, and I know it's not really readable zoomed in this closely on a screenshot, but when you go into this, you can really see exactly where your ancestors' battalion was sitting. All right, let's talk about a specific type of battalion. And I know I'm going really fast, but there's a lot to cover. Okay, so PALS infantry battalions. Anybody heard of them? One person, okay, that's good, but one very definite no back here as well. These are service battalions that were raised locally. This was a new idea for basically getting people to enlist, right? It was a recruitment campaign. Think about what happens if an entire battalion gets wiped out in a single battle and every single one of those men are from the same village. I think there's only 4 villages in England that didn't have some kind of significant impact as a result of the PALS scheme. So you have lost an entire generation of men from a single village with these PALS battalions. Obviously, it was never repeated. Didn't really work out as a great recruitment scheme, but they were promised that they would serve together, that they would stick with their buddies. So as a result, when one of these battalions got hit, they really did lose everybody. They were also classified not just by village or location, but also men in the same type of occupation or business. There are none of these from the Scottish Highlands or Ireland. This is an English thing, very specifically British. Okay. PALS battalions include what's on the screen. So the impact of the major battles, of course, was really devastating. This model was, again, never repeated. But again, you can get a full list of all the PALS infantry battalions available on Wikipedia, so you can see immediately what the impact is for your specific family. Right, military records. We're moving quick. I promised we'd move quick. All right, so at the top of almost every military document, this one's a little bit hard to read, but there is some kind of service number for each individual person. In this case, it's in the blue circle. It's 249 something something. If a soldier changed his status, they changed regiments, maybe they left the service and then rejoined later, they were given a new service number. So it is very common for soldiers to have multiple service numbers across the history of the engagement. There was a lot of variance introduced during this period to accommodate all the different regional needs. Again, thinking about the PALS battalions, and it was increasingly common for men to change units, especially in the last 18 months of the war. So if you see him changing units 3 or 4 times, that's not unusual at all. And in fact, should be relatively expected depending on what they did. So that service number follows them throughout their entire documentary record, or at least it should. So you want to be completing as, building as complete a picture of the soldier in question as you can, and you want to track all of those service numbers over time. So track as many documents as possible. Don't rely on any one historical record. You need to look at them all, and you want to utilize especially the metal index cards, and remember that the soldier often had more than one of those as well, and really think about what that service number is. Again, I've got a Post-it note on my desk for every project, and I've got all the service numbers sitting in front of me at all times. So let's look at an example really quick. This is Alexander George Lawrence. A totally random person, no relation to me at all. Born in 1885 in Surrey. He enlisted in 1916 in the Queen's unit, the Royal West Surrey Regiment. He's found twice in WO 363, the First World War service records known as the burnt documents. So again, WO standing for War Office. When you look at his materials on Find My Past, you see his service number at the bottom is 6870. That correlates to his service record and his enrollment papers. And you can see it's kind of scribbled over, but you can still make out the number there. We also find it in other areas of his records, as well as his spouse, his children, the address for the next of kin, and so forth, right? All of the things you would expect on a military record. If you look for him again in the British Army service records, you find a second service number, 32989. We go to that record, and actually it tells us that he has been transferred to a different unit, so that's a keyword that you're looking for to understand there's a new number associated with this individual. And then at the top, we actually find out that he has 3 service numbers. But one thing leads to another, right? This is the domino game, and we want to make sure we knock down every single domino. All right, let's talk about the records then. just check my time because I know I'm gonna get bogged down here. There's a lot to talk about. So we have British Army records, Royal Navy records, Merchant Navy, Royal Marines, and prisoners of war. Now I'm gonna state right from the beginning, these are all on Find My Past. I am employed by Find My Past. This is a sponsored talk, so keep that in mind. We're not going to talk about any of the other digital sources, but they are out there. They do exist. Oh, why am I not clicking? There we go. So we're going to start with the Royal Hospital Chelsea Soldier Service Records from 1760 to 1913. This is WO97. We also have the Militia Service Records from 1806 to 1915, WO96. And then the British Army Service Records is the really big one, 1914 and 1920. That includes pension records, service records, and partial rolls, and much more, actually. So when we talk about the Chelsea records, WO97, this includes other ranks only. This is not officers. So it's the average soldier. Does not include men who died or who were discharged early. Gives a summary of service, generally a 4-page attestation paper, wow, but may also include discharge documents, correspondence, and additional paperwork. They often look a lot like this. Again, I know it's kind of zoomed in, but there in the background is the full image. And again, typically a 4-page record. All right, militia service records, 58,000 of them. Skipping some, my slides apparently are not lined up, so that's fun. Okay, we'll just go with this. That's cool. Sorry, I'm going to go back a step. Sorry about that, you guys. All right, 580,000 records. I can read. This, again, is other ranks, not officers. It includes men who may also have papers in series WO97 or WO363/4, gives a summary of service, the next of kin, physical characteristics of the individual, etc. So this is kind of basic enlistment records. They typically look like this. So you've got kind of biographical information up at the top, including their occupation and their address, all sorts of bits and pieces. And then the second, third, and fourth page is often where you find the spouse, the children, the next of kin, and so forth. Okay, soldier service records, WO363, known as the burnt documents. There was a fire. Some of the records were destroyed. Not all of them survive, but you will find records that have burn marks on the edges, or maybe half a record or a partial piece of a record. They have preserved what they can. We also have the soldiers' pension records, WO364. Now, the dates on some of these titles can be misleading. So when we look at some of the collections, you want to keep in mind that if it says something like 1914 to 1920, it may actually go 1910 to 1927, right? But the bulk of it is going to be in that date range. So this is generally what they look like. Again, very similar looking form with the biographical information on the first page, where they enlisted, etc., and then a service history on the second page. And we get a little bit zoomed in so we can see a little bit of those details in terms of, absent, checked back into his unit. This guy actually ended up kind of being given some punishment from his lack of service and his kind of MIA moment. We also have records on absentees and deserters, and this was extremely common. So even if your ancestor is a decorated war hero, you need to be checking these records. This was an incredibly severe conflict. There was a lot of mental health issues happening. So men walked away from the field all the time. These are extremely rich in detail, and you can see all the different types of information provided. It is a published work, right? You can see here the Police Gazette. It's literally a published piece from the War Office listing all of the absentees and deserters from Her Majesty's service. So it goes on for pages and pages. So here's an example. This is Fred Lawrence, service number 32252, and it gives us all of this information just in this one publication. He's 30 years old, fair complexion, brown hair, brown eyes. He's a shoemaker. He was last seen 7th of September, 1914, enlisted in Sheffield, et cetera, et cetera. British Royal Navy and Royal Marines. Anybody with a Navy ancestor? My dad was in the Navy, so I always have to ask that question. It's like a rule in our household. His Majesty's Naval Service, of course, the oldest branch of the armed forces, and includes both the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines. The modern Royal Navy was established in 1707 as we know it today, and the Royal Marines founded in 1755. What you're looking at is the HMS King George. It's a cool picture. Again, we're a boat family, so I have to point it out. The Royal Navy records include a whole list of materials. You're looking at material from the British India the British India Office. That includes Army and Navy pensions. You're looking at Royal Naval officers, medal rolls, the seamen themselves, even lists like the sailors who died in the Great War, which is obviously transcribed after the conflict is over, has a lot of detailed information. This whole unit, the British Royal Navy, the Royal Marines, is really created much earlier, of course, but they kind of get their organizational system in place, just like the Army during World War I. So typical records tend to look something like this. They're often a little bit more basic because, of course, space on a ship is much more constrained, right? So the forms are generally smaller. I'm speaking kind of anecdotally at this point. This is just my experience and from what I've done in my research. You'll tend to find more index cards and smaller pieces of paper, right? It's an effort to save space. So there are opportunities to learn about the personnel in the Navy, but also the vessels that they served on and, of course, the battles that they were involved in. You'll want to look at the Royal Naval Division collection from 1914 to 1919. This includes details of men who died while serving in the Royal Naval Division. And then the second set is for officers and their rating service records. That's the Royal Naval Division service records from 1914 to 1919. I know they all sound really similar, but they are very different collections. Again, another just quick example. In this case, the service number is at the top. It's quite different. Service numbers in the Navy need their own kind of special education. Okay, so this service number is actually Clyde Z/2454. The Clyde indicates the Clyde Division, which was based in Glasgow. A Clyde man might have a number of Clyde like this one, which means in this case, this is letter Z, which was implemented in 1914. Then the service number is 2454. It indicates the first company. So here, David Lawrence was the Clyde Division Z/2454. That's his full service number. If you want to learn more about Royal Naval Division numbering, and if you have a Navy guy, you really want to, go to this site. It's the best I have found that explains this whole system. So for more details, you really want to reference the Royal Naval Division.info is the URL on this one. And they break it all down. All right, Merchant Navy. So Merchant Navy records include most service records for the period. They were destroyed by the Board of Trade. Sorry about that. Service records online cover from 1835 to 57 and then 1918 to 1941. And so then we're missing kind of the most important years of the war, right? But we do have the medal cards from 1914 to 1925. So that's kind of our primary source for the Merchant Navy. You can see in this example that his time starts in 1918 and continues through the end of active duty service related to the war. He was discharged to Crystal Palace in London. But you can see right on the register card, right, we start at 1918, British Expeditionary Force, right? And then granted, the sentence continues, he leaves to the UK, et cetera, and it goes all the way down through to 1919. Royal Marine Service records from 1899 to 1919. These are, again, from the National Archives. Now, this time it's an ADM reference instead of a War Office reference. So Admiralty records, 159. There's 137,000 images, but the service records for just over 15,000 World War I enlisted men are missing from this particular set. So these ones, again, very formulaic, very much kind of looking like a military record. This particular individual is presumed dead, April 28, 1917 in Flanders, Sidney Charles Lawrence. We've got his register number, which in this case is his service number, same thing up the top, and then his basic military reference and history. Everybody still with me? Okay. Haven't lost anybody yet completely. It's good. Royal Air Force. So those materials include the Royal Air Force Airman Service Record, big one, 1914 and 1920. That includes pension records, service records, and partial rolls of old British Army forms. They're new and a little bit easier to read. So they tend to look like this, and they include, of course, all the service history, often the movements and attachments that they made, and then as they move through their different factors of service. Right, lastly, I think this is the last big category, is prisoners of war. May include only surnames, right, in this case, and a lot of abbreviations for the first names, because of course these are records created in Germany most often, right? So these are British men who are being held by the enemy. So we actually recommend that when you search these records, you start with only a surname, because that's almost always what you're going to get. You also need to understand that the first name may be written as a title, right? And I can't pronounce it properly in German, but the German titles for Mr. and other military ranks. So the prisoner of war records include everything that you see in front of you. They are often typed and very easy to read in most cases, and they are transcribed into English on Find My Past. So you get the full understanding of what all of these mean, although it is pretty straightforward once you kind of look at them and start to understand the records, right? It's where they're being held, when they were captured, often their father's name and their occupation back home as well, and where they were born. Other key collections that you want to look at. The 1911 census, we already mentioned a little bit, but we also want to think about the 1921 census, which of course covers the family after the war. We want to think about the British Red Cross and Order of the St. John Inquiry List, war diaries, and newspapers. Those are all super important. So from the census perspective, the military, of course, is documented and enumerated in the census collection. So 1911 at the top, 1921 at the bottom. But the 1921 census is actually quite striking, right? As people are recovering from the war, you'll often get entries like this one. This is Harold Samuel Crippen. He was 46 at the time of the census, and he says, I couldn't use ink as per the instructions. I had to use a typewriter because I lost half my right hand in the late war and I can no longer write. 1921 census is full of these very touching, heartbreaking moments documented by veterans who had come home and are now doing their best to recover during a very difficult period in England. British Red Cross and Order of St. John records. These are a series of lists that were published in the war, during the war. There's 21 of them in total. They're generally available online. These are at the Imperial War Museum. So these are all the people who basically said, I'm looking for my brother John. British Red Cross, do you know where he is? Is he in one of your hospitals, in one of your facilities? So these hospital visitors were encouraged to ask wounded soldiers about missing men. So if you were a volunteer with the Red Cross and you went in and held somebody's hand and talked to them and comforted them, it would say, how many men did you serve with? Where were you injured? Do you know any of their names? Can we track them down? So they were really trying to be a conduit for people back home and for the soldiers. They also included tips on exactly how to do this. So you want to make sure that you kind of read through these documents and understand the context. There's at times mentions like this, where this is a kind of a personal testimony talking about one of those PAL battalions and kind of his experiences during the war and with his unit. Okay, the war diaries, really, really important. If you take nothing else away from this talk, please take this. The war diaries are held at the National Archives. They're available online for free. You can simply use your favorite search engine and say War Diaries TNA, and it will come right up. You can also use the research guides that are available on their website and that we talked about at the beginning of the session. Some of these war diaries are on other sites, so you can access them in other places, but they are free, and you can just simply download them from the TNA, and you have them on your hard drive forever. So the war diaries from TNA include France and Flanders, the Mesopotamia, Iraq and North Persia, Theater, East Africa and West Africa, and they give you suggestions on how to find the particular war diary that you're looking for. There's a pretty massive list. They've been digitized again. They're all available. You get them as a PDF. I'm starting to actually build an entire library. I've just found them so useful that I save every one that I find and that I need in my research, and I have a folder specifically in my storage for war diaries. When you access them, it will ask you to order them and add to the basket. But once you sign in, the price changes to $0. So they really are free. Oh, and I have an example in a couple slides, so we'll try to get to that. But quickly, let's go through newspapers. Obviously, also very important. Find My Past has the largest digitized collection of British and Irish newspapers available, over 90 billion images. We just hit that number yesterday or the day before, so we're quite excited about that. But of course, lots of coverage on the war, lots of this man is missing, this man has been declared killed in action, but also very topical content, right? Like the Women's Land Army and their efforts. And even this cute little picture of the doggy. Can't resist a dog picture. Reports of battles in the newspapers, bravery, lots of different stories, of course. The casualties and killed in action and missing in action lists are published on a daily basis in every newspaper across the country. Right, a few additional resources to think about. There's a bunch on my list here. I think that might be all. One more, okay, to understand everything. Lots of information on Google Books and other published materials like that, Internet Archive, those kinds of sites. The Families in British India Society website is fantastic. You want to look at eBay for medals, the Great War Forum, Army service numbers, and so forth. Let me see. And then I was going to tell you a story about Eli Collins, but I'm out of time. So I'm just going to skip ahead to his war diary. He loses an arm during the war. He spends time at Roehampton, which is the major hospital in the area, okay, for that type of recovery. This is what the war diaries look like. He was actually injured twice. And we were able to determine that through the use of the war diaries and the newspapers that it is, of course, the second injury that results in the loss of his arm. But his descendants didn't know about the first injury at all. So this was completely new information to them. The day he was injured the first time, there were 5 killed and 45 wounded, which included Eli. This particular war diary also included the actual order that his commanding officer received, and it's glued into the pages. I've never seen this before. It's very unique. I got a big wow up here in the front row, which is great. But this will tell you exactly what they expected to happen that day. Right? This is what their commanding officer actually got in the field. And that's a pretty incredible discovery. Okay, let's move forward a little bit to my last summary slides. Eli's story goes on for a while. We have a video on it on our social media if you really want to watch. But a few key learnings. Start with what you know. As always, those primary questions you want to answer. Document everything. Think about all the different ways the military might write their name down. You want to keep an open mind, be willing to review historical documents that don't match exactly. Think about PALS battalions and the various service numbers and the various units they might have fought in, right? Learning about that unit will tell you a lot about your ancestor's actual experience, whether it names him or not. Document, of course, as you go, tracking all those possible service numbers, and take your time. There are a lot of records here, a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of history. This is a very detailed type of research. So really give yourself a good window of time to work through this process. Because yes, it's exciting to find that first record and go, oh, he served in the war and here's his medal card. But there's so much more to that story. So really delve into all of the available resources. If you need help, reach out to us. Find My Past is really happy to talk to you. And of course, we have a stand here in the expo hall. But in addition to that, we'd love to talk to you. support@findmypast.com is the best way to reach us. If you're in the US, this 855 number is toll free. And if you call that number, you get to talk to our customer service people. They are all Scottish. So you get this lovely Scottish accent, which is fantastic. But you can, of course, always reach us by email or on social media as well. And I think my time is up. So we'll go into Q&A. Yeah, great. Which means I get to put this headset on. Do I need to do anything else? Or I just put it on? Okay. This is oh, now I can hear myself. That's weird. Okay, I'm ready.
We do have one question from the online audience. The question is, my grandfather fought in World War I and World War II. Story was that he was too young for the first and too old for the second. How old were you supposed to be to fight in World War I?
I think the legal age was 17, if I remember correctly. It's a great question. And really interesting that he fought in both, although it's not terribly uncommon. But of course, the availability of having something like a birth certificate wasn't something they carried around with them. There wasn't any really formal form of ID. So it's not like everybody had a driver's license in their pocket. So if you looked old enough, there's plenty of situations where people did enlist very young.
Hi, I got more of a comment about the war diaries. Interesting reading. When my great grandfather was, they were on the run. They were heading back towards the coast. Long story short, read them, because even though they were under attack, they stopped, had showers.
And much earlier, of course, but they kind of get their organizational system in place, just like the Army during World War I. So typical records tend to look something like this. They're often a little bit more basic because, of course, space on a ship is much more constrained, right? So the forms are generally smaller. I'm speaking kind of anecdotally at this point. This is just my experience and from what I've done in my research. You'll tend to find more index cards and smaller pieces of paper, right? It's an effort to save space. So there are opportunities to learn about the personnel in the Navy, but also the vessels that they served on and, of course, the battles that they were involved in. You'll want to look at the Royal Naval Division collection from 1914 to 1919. This includes details of men who died while serving in the Royal Naval Division. And then the second set is for officers and their rating service records. That's the Royal Naval Division service records from 1914 to 1919. I know they all sound really similar, but they are very different collections. Again, another just quick example. In this case, the service number is at the top. It's quite different. Service numbers in the Navy need their own kind of special education. Okay, so this service number is actually Clyde Z/2454. The Clyde indicates the Clyde Division, which was based in Glasgow. A Clyde man might have a number of Clyde like this one, which means in this case, this is letter Z, which was implemented in 1914. Then the service number is 2454. It indicates the first company. So here, David Lawrence was the Clyde Division Z/2454. That's his full service number. If you want to learn more about Royal Naval Division numbering, and if you have a Navy guy you really want to, go to this site. It's the best I have found that explains this whole system. So for more details, you really want to reference the Royal Naval Division.info is the URL on this one. And they break it all down. All right, Merchant Navy. So Merchant Navy records include most service records for the period. They were destroyed by the Board of Trade. Sorry about that. Service records online cover from 1835 to 57 and then 1918 to 1941. And so then we're missing kind of the most important years of the war, right? But we do have the medal cards from 1914 to 1925. So that's kind of our primary source for the Merchant Navy. You can see in this example that his time starts in 1918 and continues through the end of active duty service related to the war. He was discharged to Crystal Palace in London. But you can see right on the register card, right, we start at 1918, British Expeditionary Force, right? And then granted, the sentence continues, he leaves to the UK, et cetera, and it goes all the way down through to 1919. Royal Marine Service records from 1899 to 1919. These are, again, from the National Archives. Now, this time it's an ADM reference instead of a War Office reference. So Admiralty records, 159. There's 137,000 images, but the service records for just over 15,000 World War I enlisted men are missing from this particular set. So these ones, again, very formulaic, very much kind of looking like a military record. This particular individual is presumed dead, April 28, 1917 in Flanders, Sidney Charles Lawrence. We've got his register number, which in this case is his service number, same thing up the top, and then his basic military reference and history. Everybody still with me? Okay. Haven't lost anybody yet completely. It's good. Royal Air Force. So those materials include the Royal Air Force Airman Service Records, the Officer Service Records, the Women's Royal Air Force, and the RAF muster rolls starting in April of 1918. So these records, again, very militaristic, but a little cleaner, a little easier to read. Because these are relatively new. It's a new form, right? They create this during the middle of the war instead of using the form from the last, couple of decades worth of military history. We're not using kind of old British Army forms. They're new and a little bit easier to read. So they tend to look like this, and they include, of course, all the service history, often the movements and attachments that they made, and then as they move through their different factors of service. Right, lastly, I think this is the last big category, is prisoners of war. May include only surnames, right, in this case, and a lot of abbreviations for the first names, because of course these are records created in Germany most often, right? So these are British men who are being held by the enemy. So we actually recommend that when you search these records, you start with only a surname, because that's almost always what you're going to get. You also need to understand that the first name may be written as a title, right? And I can't pronounce it properly in German, but the German titles for Mr. and other military ranks. So the prisoner of war records include everything that you see in front of you. They are often typed and very easy to read in most cases, and they are transcribed into English on Find My Past. So you get the full understanding of what all of these mean, although it is pretty straightforward once you kind of look at them and start to understand the records, right? It's where they're being held, when they were captured, often their father's name and their occupation back home as well, and where they were born. Other key collections that you want to look at. The 1911 census, we already mentioned a little bit. But we also want to think about the 1921 census, which of course covers the family after the war. We want to think about the British Red Cross and Order of the St. John Inquiry List, war diaries, and newspapers. Those are all super important. So from the census perspective, the military, of course, is documented and enumerated in the census collection. So 1911 at the top, 1921 at the bottom. But the 1921 census is actually quite striking, right? As people are recovering from the war, you'll often get entries like this one. This is Harold Samuel Crippen. He was 46 at the time of the census, and he says, I couldn't use ink as per the instructions. I had to use a typewriter because I lost half my right hand in the late war and I can no longer write. 1921 census is full of these very touching, heartbreaking moments documented by veterans who had come home and are now doing their best to recover during a very difficult period in England. British Red Cross and Order of St. John records. These are a series of lists that were published in the war, during the war. There's 21 of them in total. They're generally available online. These are at the Imperial War Museum. So these are all the people who basically said, I'm looking for my brother John. British Red Cross, do you know where he is? Is he in one of your hospitals, in one of your facilities? So